Thank you, Abby. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this workshop. And also thank you to the previous speakers for laying the groundwork with some very interesting and focused talks around capacity and other issues related to MSP. So I've been asked to give a relatively high-level brief overview of capacity concerns for MSP. And this is of course important because capacity is foundational to an approach such as MSP, which, as we've been hearing, is really a transformational way of viewing our management of ocean space, and is intended effectively to be a permanent process. And while this is the case, we do have to also acknowledge the iterative nature of MSP and the phases that we need to go through. So in keeping my presentation relatively high level, I do want to consider those phases with respect to the capacity needs, so that we can anticipate, the conversation we need to have and the preparations we need to make for capacity at each of those phases. Next slide, please. Many of you would be familiar with the UNESCO IOC step-by-step guidance provided for MSP, and it's really useful to consider the 10 steps for MSP when we start considering capacity needs, as each step has an implicit consideration for capacity, or expectation even for capacity. What's not really implicit from this diagram showing the 10 steps that guide us through the MSP process is that really steps 1 through 7 focus on the conditions that are necessary and the processes that are necessary to develop our plans and our scenarios for ocean space. And then steps 8 through 10 go into the implementation of those plans. And I think that's significant to note, especially when we consider the capacities for each. So, starting with step 1 and through 7, this phase really is where we are now in Kenya, starting with the pre-planning and the planning aspects to be able to organize ourselves, to prepare for the situations that we're going to find ourselves in as we address some of the latter stages. But also really needing to anticipate steps 8, 9, and 10, where implementation really should flow from the plan. And we don't want to see any incongruity or challenges created by the early steps that don't allow us to move seamlessly into the implementation phases. Next slide, please. So from this, we can distill these core areas for capacity. And of course, in every location, these are going to be different, and they're going to touch down in different ways in government, in private sector, in civil society. But generally, these areas, process design and approach, are necessary for guiding the process for a team to drive it, relying on the science, data, and tools, facilitation, project management skills, policy and government relations, the finance and funding that's instrumental, but understanding what's available and what's possible up front. And of course, the stakeholder engagement. We've been hearing a lot about that today. If anyone at this point doesn't already appreciate the degree to which MSP is founded on stakeholder engagement processes, this is really something that has to come through. The process itself is hinged on the ability for the key stakeholders' voices and interests to be taken up, to be heard, to be understood, and then processed into the plans and considered amidst the priorities of the national government and other stakeholders for sort of a uniform, balanced outcomes. So at TNC, we also look at these key areas where our intention is to support across all of these the implementation and development of MSP. So we have a team that looks at developing expertise, and we therefore provide, as was mentioned earlier today, through partnership to the government of Kenya, technical support across this whole range of capacities. Next slide, please. It's also important to remember that capacity concerns extend to the stakeholders themselves. You know, there's of course a broad range of stakeholders. We've been hearing a lot about some of these over the presentations last week and this week. And the stakeholders vary in terms of their organization and their interest in MSP, but really ultimately their ability to prepare for MSP, and by prepare I mean really understand what the process means to them, how the process is organized, but then also prepare their own information, their own data, their own human resources to be able to engage. And then how do they engage and communicate? And ultimately, how do they process the outcomes and decisions of an MSP process and the area-specific plans that emerge? So these capacities have to be considered upfront as well. Next slide, please. And while we can't anticipate all of the capacity requirements upfront, we do need to consider the enabling conditions, certainly for those pre-planning and planning phases where we find ourselves right now in Kenya. You know, we need to consider the capacities that support the various entities that are authorized to drive MSP forward, the authority to make, develop, and implement plans, and how well respected that authority is across all sectors. So then, is there a need for, and do we have champions to drive the MSP? And what other drivers are pushing MSP forward? Understanding the rationale behind the MSP. Blue economy certainly is a consideration, but what aspects of a blue economy provide the rationale or that reason for the planning that we're doing? And ultimately, this becomes quite important because the drivers will form the objectives of the MSP, and the objectives will form the priorities, and the decisions will be made by those objectives and those priorities. So what exactly we are planning for and those outcomes we want to see are quite important to establish, and they will help guide how our capacities emerge to drive the process forward. But also understanding our financial resources. This will allow us to assess what we can and cannot plan for in terms of capacities. Where do we stand in terms of baselines for information, data, and knowledge? And where do we need to be? And where do we stand at all levels of leadership, technical and political? And how is this backstopped by the current legal frameworks? We've been hearing a little bit about that in the last presentation. Who is supporting and wanting MSP versus who is against it, and why are they against it? So being able to anticipate, as well as anticipate mechanisms for overcoming the challenges that lie in the face of MSP is quite important up front. And of course, there's staff capacity concerns, and that's something that's universal and needs to be addressed. That extends to skills as well as other human resource considerations. And then, of course, stakeholder engagement capacity. And in areas where community-based conservation, community-based resilience approaches are really paramount, the community stakeholder interests really will emerge, and their ability to participate as a key capacity concern. Next slide, please. So one can dive a little bit deeper into the staffing needs, the human resource needs. And generally, we recognize that these fall into these 5 areas: process management, science and planning, stakeholder engagement, communications, and then a lot of the services that will have to ultimately be addressed through consultancies. But what's important here is that each of these areas is steered through a team. And the team, each team you'll note has a lead, has leadership. So the process management team might be quite a broad team. And each of these teams might have components within government and within civil society and NGOs, academia, or other, but they need to be able to function as a team. So that's another dimension of capacity that needs to be considered, where the pieces of the puzzle are being drawn from. and how each of these teams is composed internally, and how these teams work together then as an overall MSP team. Next slide, please. And so even though the implementation phase may be several years down the road, generally the planning is likely to take from 3 to 5 years before we'll have plans that can be approved. We should still anticipate the necessary capacities and indeed the conditions that would allow for a seamless transfer into implementation of the MSP. So what are those implications for the governance arrangements, for the various options that we're considering along the way, the scenarios, the spatial scenarios that are going to be considered as part of the MSP process? Financing certain components and costs that we can anticipate now, how are those financing arrangements put in place? As well as once we establish the zones and the management plans for them, what are the implications for monitoring, control, and surveillance? But then also long-term sustainable financing options. This is something we're already considering upfront with the government of Kenya, because it becomes important how added value can be built in to various aspects of MSP operations. Where do the legal and regulatory requirements for adopting the plan sit now versus where they need to sit when we go from the various plans emerging to adoption to implementation? And what does that mean for research and monitoring, as well as what I said up front, the final stages of the 10 steps, 8, 9, and 10, where we have to look at the indicators and the criteria for how we evaluate our plans. How do we go back critically and evaluate the plans and adapt them to be re-implemented over time? Because again, I can't reinforce enough that this is a permanent process that will continue iteratively to build on itself. And a lot of these capacities, while permanent, will change over time. Next slide, please. So I hope that gives a relatively high level but clear indication of some of the areas where capacity considerations need to start right from the get-go. Thank you very much.